Namaste, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So thank you very much for joining. Welcome to Vayu. This is our Distinguished Speaker Series webinar with Dr. Bir Khalsa. So before I introduce him and give this floor to him, just a quick housekeeping. So again, you joined Vayu Vivekananda Yoga University, the first yoga university outside India, doing graduate education and research. And we conduct these distinguished speaker, series webinars with thought leaders to bring in various topics from philosophy to therapy to research. We will be running a couple of polls, so kindly do respond to those polls. And so let me first, so we would like to know where you're joining from. It's very important. We have a global audience here. So now let me introduce the speaker and the topic. So today's esteemed speaker is Dr. Bir Khalsa, PhD. He's a Vayu faculty, of course, and an associate professor at Harvard Medical School. He has been engaged in biomedical research on the efficacy of yoga and meditation practices in improving physical and psychological health since 2001. He has practiced Kundalini Yoga since 1971 and is a certified instructor. He's a director of research for the Kundalini Research Institute, a research associate at the Benson Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine, a research affiliate, the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine, and an associate professor of medicine, as I mentioned, at Harvard Medical School. So again, is a very prolific career, a dear friend, a colleague, and today he'll be talking about yoga and spirituality, the science and biomedical psychophysiological research. So he'll be throwing a light on the science and research on the psychophysiology of yoga practices that underlie its ability to increase the experience of spirituality, the published research, evidence for improvements in spirituality with yoga, and the relevance and importance of improvements in spirituality with yoga to health, behavior, and healthcare in modern society. So without further ado, Sadhbir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation, Prashant and Professor Srinath. It's always a pleasure to give a seminar through Vayu, especially through the Distinguished Speaker Series. So the purpose of my presentation today is really to talk about yoga for spirituality. And what I'm planning to show will be, first of all, the importance, I think, the current importance of spirituality, especially with respect to modern healthcare and modern society. I'll then talk about what I believe is the way in which yoga and meditation can facilitate changes in spirituality, the so-called mystical experience, and give you sort of a scientific psychophysiological rationale for how these practices generate these states of consciousness and changes in spirituality, and then show you some research evidence for the changes that occur in spirituality with yoga practice. So first of all, I want to talk about sort of the relevance of spirituality for health. But even before I sort of take a broad view of that importance, I think it's important to make some definitions, because there is often a conflation between the term spirituality and the term religion. And the definition that I have on this slide was taken from the Chopra Center. And I like this definition because it really distinguishes these two different constructs. So religion at its core is about faith. It's belief in something based upon unconditional acceptance of the religion's teachings. Unlike the scientific worldview, religions don't require evidence to validate their claims. Through religion, you are taught to have faith in God or the scriptures as being the infallible and ultimate truth of reality. Acceptance and surrender to the divine are taught as the path that leads to ultimate salvation. So in essence, religion is based upon a belief system. Spirituality, on the other hand, does not dismiss faith. However, it leans more heavily on direct experience of the soul or divinity. Spiritual practices such as meditation, yoga, silence, and contemplation allow you to make conscious contact with more expanded states of consciousness, thus helping to experientially validate the teachings rather than accepting them on faith alone. You know something because you have tasted the experience yourself and have allowed it to resonate, as opposed to taking the word of another. So in this definition, spirituality is essentially an experience, an experiential state. It does not require belief, does not require intellectual activity. It is an actual experience. And so that is really the definition that I'm using today in this talk. I'm focusing on this experiential component of spirituality as opposed to religious activity. Now, spirituality, again, is different than religiosity. This is another definition taken from Polish researchers. It is important to note that the term spirituality is much more capacious than the concept of religiousness, and is often understood in a more multifaceted and interdisciplinary way. Tanya Ruth perceives spirituality as an individual's search for meaning and purpose in life, which does not necessarily have to be related to religion. Now, of course, having said all of this, many people who are religious do experience spirituality. So there is a large overlap between religious activity and spirituality. However, my focus today is really on what I'm going to refer to as pure spirituality, the experience itself. And this is a paper that talks about the importance of religiosity or spirituality, recognizing and understanding the potentially powerful roles that religiousness and spirituality may serve in the prevention and amelioration of disease, as well as symptom management and health-related quality of life, significantly enhances research and clinical efforts across many areas of behavioral medicine. And the first author of this is Crystal Park, who is a yoga researcher who's done studies on the spirituality through yoga practice. And I'll show you some of that research later on in this presentation. But this whole idea of spirituality in medicine and healthcare is starting to become an important issue. And some of the evidence of that is occurring in some of the recent publications. So this is a publication in one of our premier biomedical journals, JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, in 2022. This was a Delphi study focusing on spirituality and the importance of spirituality, especially in patients who have serious disease and perhaps life-threatening diseases. So this is really a landmark paper to see published in a major biomedical journal. Another major biomedical journal with even a more recent paper, this was published in March 2024 in the New England Journal of Medicine, talking about spirituality and patient care. And some of the quotes from this paper, abundant data show that patients want their physicians to help address their spiritual needs, and that patients whose spiritual needs have been met are aided in making difficult decisions, particularly at the end of life, and are more satisfied with their care and report better quality of life. The past few decades have seen an international revival of interest in the role of spirituality in patient care. I believe this trend is salutary for patients and healthcare professionals alike. In fact, this whole construct of spirituality has been promoted by the director of the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. Dr. Ellen Langevin has posted an article on the NCCIH webpage talking about the importance of spirituality into a fuller picture of integrative medicine, a whole person health approach, of not just treating diseases and physical symptoms, but actually treating the whole person, which includes this construct of spirituality. Furthermore, the World Health Organization has also recognized this. From this paper, contemporary World Health Organization guidelines also refer to 6 basic dimensions of health quality. These are physical, psychological, autonomous, social, environmental, and spiritual dimensions. The assessment of the quality of life based on these aspects allows us to identify which area causes the greatest discomfort to the patient. One of the primary areas is the spiritual dimension of the patient. Spirituality itself is not a homogeneous term, although it should be noted as continuously growing in importance, including in the area of health psychology. And in fact, this whole construct of spirituality is starting to appear in the biomedical literature. So these are searches that I did on the medical database PubMed. And searching for publications which have the word spirituality in the title, you can see this trend. Basically, in the early 1980s is the first time we are seeing any papers published in this biomedical database. But you can see this increasing trend. There are over 250 publications in 2022. If you do another search with spirituality in the title of the article, but also require that this be either a systematic review, a meta-analysis, or a simple review, you can see that obviously there's a delay, but nevertheless, there is also this growth. And in 2024, we see over 40 reviews or meta-analyses of papers that are related to spirituality. Now, of course, these papers oftentimes might not have distinguished between spirituality and religiosity. And of course, the study of religiosity and devoutness to one's religion in modern medicine is another area of very strong research. But we are focused again, as I say, on the pure spirituality aspect. And when we're talking about spirituality, what we're really talking about are so-called contemplative states, these altered states of consciousness, these changes in perception. And one of my main tenets in this presentation is that the experience of these brief or short-term contemplative states ultimately leads to changes and improvements in overall sort of lasting spirituality, long-term spirituality, this deeper experience, this different perception of life, a transformation in terms of life goals. Typically, we're talking about non-materialistic goals in life as opposed to materialistic goals in life. And I believe these brief contemplative states that occur in yoga and meditation can lead to these sort of global changes in spirituality. Now, what are these brief contemplative states? Well, these are known by a number of different terms. One of the most common terms is the mystical experience. And mysticism is actually a bona fide field of philosophy. Mystical states are transient states of consciousness, usually lasting for only a few minutes and distinctly different from normal consciousness. The person typically experiences them passively, not a product of personal will or control, and has a difficult time expressing the experience in words. They are usually intense, positive, joyful experiences, and often the person senses the presence of an awe-inspiring transcendent other. Often there is a noetic element of revelation, a sudden knowing of a new truth. An experience of unity is common. For an example, an ineffable oneness with all of humankind, with nature, or with the universe. And there have been many terms in different disciplines to describe this mystical experience. So from Oriental Indian subcontinent terms, samadhi is specifically a yoga term which refers to this mystical state. There are other terms in India, sahaj, nirvana, turiya, moksha, bodhi, and a term that's more associated with Zen Buddhism, satori. In terms of English language descriptions, it's been called the mystical state, unitive state, enlightenment, the Kundalini awakening, spiritual awakening, transcendence, the peak experience, really popularized by Abraham Maslow, cosmic consciousness, universal consciousness, the noetic experience, the flow state, which we'll talk about, which was really promoted by Csikszentmihalyi, insight, or even more recently, the construct of quantum change. And in simple single terms, the closest one can come to describing this mystical state is oneness or union, and essentially the reverse of that, non-duality, and often associated with experiences such as ecstasy, bliss, absorption, merger, consummation, or rapture. And what we know about the mystical experience is it does have certain characteristics which have been observed across history in many different traditions. And there are characteristics of this experience. One of these is a sense of internal unity, a sense of experiencing pure being and pure awareness within oneself. There's also a sense of external unity, an experience of oneness or unity with objects or persons in your surroundings. The noetic quality, the gainful feeling of insightful knowledge, deep ultimate truth, if you will. A sense of sacredness, a sense of being at a spiritual height, a sense of reverence. And these states are also associated with positive mood states, feelings of amazement, tenderness, gentleness, peace and tranquility, experience of ecstasy. There's also often a space-time distortion, a loss of one's usual sense of time, a usual sense of space. And then finally, another characteristic is that it's so profound and so different from ordinary states of consciousness that people feel that it cannot be described adequately in words. And these characteristics have actually been used to create metrics, questionnaires that can evaluate whether one has experienced this mystical state or whether these have changed in any form over time. Now, one change that has been very commonly noted, especially with respect to yoga, is this whole idea of Kundalini awakening. And sometimes these sort of sudden spiritual experiences can be very disturbing to individuals. And in some cases, there's a large overlap in the symptoms and the experiences of this sort of Kundalini awakening, the transcendent experience, and the psychotic experience. And actually, it is therefore important to really distinguish between someone who is having a true spiritual Kundalini awakening or someone who is having a psychotic episode. And these authors from the National Institutes of Mental Health and Neuroscience in Bengaluru, which is India's premier psychiatric institution and has a yoga center, have talked about this in a paper. They say it's important to understand and to be able to differentiate tendencies to schizophrenia from spiritual advancement. Although there may appear to be superficial similarities in a gross clinical level, the two differ in intentions in subtle ways. In schizophrenia, alterations of sense of self involve weakening of the ego, leading to its derangement and loss of control over mind and senses. In spiritually advanced personalities, the ego is not deranged. Rather, by surrendering to the higher being, it undergoes a gradual merging into a higher unlimited self, ego effacement. Such a person, in fact, becomes more aware of his ego and by developing mastery over it, gains the freedom to use it or let it go. So these are important characteristics of this mystical state. So this cartoon reads, "Oh yeah, well, my dad can reach a higher plane of consciousness than your dad." So now I want to turn to some of the research that's been done on these contemplative states, on these mystical experiences. And I think the direction of this is leading us into an understanding of some of the neurological mechanisms. And interestingly, some of the strongest research is coming from the work with classic hallucinogens. And one of the leaders in this field is the late Roland Griffiths, who did a number of studies that really give us a lot of insight into the neurophysiology of how these experiences may be occurring. So this is from a paper they published in 2018. Analysis of the biological correlates suggestive of underlying mechanisms of mystical experiences are tractable. We have highlighted an intriguing overlap in neural findings on classic hallucinogens and neural findings on meditative practices that may occasion mystical experiences. More specifically, changes in activity, connectivity, and neural oscillatory processes in regions of the default mode network may underline dimensions of mystical experience, especially decreased self-referential processing and altered sense of time and space that accompany introvertive mystical experiences. And one of the interesting things about this line of research is what it's telling us is that these mystical experiences are a product of brain activity. They are not something outside of the brain, although there's a whole philosophical argument about where these spiritual states are. Are they extra physical, or are they internal to the central nervous system? And the fact that these psychedelic substances can actually generate these states suggests that it is a process within the central nervous system. And in fact, this actually fits very well with practices which are designed to generate these states, because in yoga, for example, we are trying to generate an optimal state of nervous system functioning that can allow these positive experiences to happen. So in another paper by Roland Griffiths' group, basic scientific studies using classic psychedelics have led to numerous advances in the experimental study of mystical experiences. These studies collectively suggest the possibility that the pattern and structure of communication between brain networks constitutes the neurobiological basis of consciousness, such that alterations of consciousness are driven by alterations of communication between brain regions. And this is a very nice quote because it gives us some information about how the nervous system is experiencing these. Many people have thought about a specific brain region, just one sort of region in the brain that when that's triggered, you have this experience. And what this study is suggesting is that it's not a single nucleus within the brain, a single point. It is a brain network interaction. Different regions of the brain are interacting in such a way that this experience is manifested. Now, another topic that has been raised with respect to mystical experiences is the effect of these mystical experiences on the person who's experiencing them. And a construct in the field of psychology has been called the quantum change to try and reflect what happens to individuals when they have these contemplative mystical states. And so this is from a paper published back in 2004. A common response when we asked people what had changed, and this was after a mystical experience, was everything. However, there were some common areas of transformation in our narratives. They often reported a sense of settled peacefulness and safety as an immediate and enduring after effect. Another major change that quantum changers reported was in their values and priorities, an abrupt and enduring shift in their most central values. They were no longer possessed by their possessions. Often, characteristics that had been valued least became most important, and those that had ranked as high as priorities fell to the bottom. Spirituality, though not necessarily religion, became central for many. So for me, this is a very critical construct. The idea that these mystical states can then generate changes in individuals that manifest this change in sort of global spirituality. And turning to some of the specific research, this is a study, early study done by Roland Griffith's group, in which they looked at the mysticism scale, which measures this mystical state based upon those different characteristics and symptoms that people experience when they have it. So at the screening, the baseline, their total score was at this level here before they received the psychoactive substance. When they were in the study and received the psychoactive substance, you can see the score increase. But what is interesting is 14 months later, they then also evaluated their score, and that score was maintained. So although these mystical experiences are brief, they lend to long-term changes in individuals' psychological contemplative state. He's gone further, and in this particular study, which is published in 2018, his group looked at an intervention in which there were three there were three interventions. One was a low dose of hallucinogen, then there was a high dose of hallucinogen, and then there was a high dose with high support, and the support in this case was meditative practices. And so what you can see is that the high dose obviously generated more positive social effects, but there was an increased additive nature to the meditative practices. And you see that in terms of increased spirituality, in which the high dose generates more of a change in spirituality. But when you add these contemplative practices, these behavioral meditative practices to this, you get an additional increase in that spirituality. And that occurs also with respect to how significant the spiritual experience was, positive behavior changes, well-being and life satisfaction, as well as how spiritually significant the experience was. So this really gives us this overlap between meditative experiences and the hallucinogen. And the idea here is that potentially both of these practices are promoting changes in the same brain networks and the same brain activity. So this is another paper which really focuses on this whole idea about how the brain is manifesting these changes. and this is recently published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. With the new sophisticated tools available to neuroscientists, an enormous amount of research has gone into uncovering the neuroscientific foundations of religious experience. This research is most dramatic and convincing when carried out in vivo manner. For example, studying, meditating, and praying subjects with imaging and neurochemical technologies. Although the results frequently vary from one research protocol to another, they generally converge with a focus on limbic structures and the prefrontal cortex as the seats of religious experience. And this is important because we know that meditative practices really are engaging the prefrontal cortex. These are where the attention networks are. And the limbic structures are structures that are involved in stress and emotion regulation. And so a lot of rumination and negative mind wandering is based in the limbic structure. So this is really bringing us together with how these mind-body practices are really potentially working on the brain to generate an optimum state where this mystical state can be manifested. So this cartoon reads, "What's the meaning of life? But make it quick. I've got an important meeting in half an hour." So now let's turn our attention to yoga and meditation as contemplative spiritual practices. And in fact, yoga and meditation practices are historically based upon the goal of spirituality, the ultimate goal of yoga, the eighth limb of yoga, samadhi, this experience of this unitive state of consciousness. And this is described very succinctly by scholar Sri Aurobindo, who had written very eloquently on the practices of yoga. And he defined it as a methodized effort towards self-perfection by the expression of the secret potentialities latent in the being, a union of the human individual with the universal and transcendent existence. So he's talking about the expression of these mystical states and the generation of spirituality overall. Now, yoga practices incorporate multiple components. The four major components we see are the well-known and well-visible physical postures and exercises, the breathing exercises of pranayama, the deep relaxation practices, and very importantly, the meditative component. Although there are many styles of yoga in modern society which are really focused on the postures and exercises, traditional yoga really incorporates all of these. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that meditation is perhaps the most important component in leading to these contemplative states. But it is very important to have these physical components there to support the psychophysiological changes that meditation can produce. And research on the psychophysiology of yoga really gives us a suggestion of how this is working. So in traditional yoga, we have these four basic components: postures, breathing, relaxation, and meditation. We know that from each one of these alone, we can make improvements in physical functioning, including things like flexibility, strength, respiratory function. And through the mind-body connection, these improvements in physical functioning ultimately change mental and emotional functioning. We know that from each of these practices by itself or together in some combination in traditional yoga, we are improving self-regulation of internal state, both physical and psychological. And the most important psychological changes are improvements in stress and emotion regulation, which leads to improvements in resilience and tolerance to stress and emotional equanimity, which leads to an overall self-efficacy of mental functioning. And of course, if we're talking about optimizing mental functioning, here we are optimizing brain functioning to potentially prepare for the induction of these contemplative states. It's largely through the meditative component, in which we focus attention on a target, that we increase mind-body awareness or mindfulness. We do this by engaging the attention networks in the prefrontal cortex. Because we're engaging the attention networks, we improve our concentration and our cognition. And over time, we gain an understanding of the nature of human thoughts. And that leads to the realization that we are not our thoughts, because we have the ability to change our reactivity to our own thought processes, and we have the ability to, in fact, change these thought processes. And this whole idea of metacognition goes back to the most ancient yogic scriptures. In fact, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are really talking about this induction of metacognition. this realization that we are beyond our thoughts and we have the ability to self-regulate our thought processes. And then finally, it is most likely largely through the meditative component of yoga that we are inducing these unitive states, these experiences of transcendence, the flow state, which leads people to this deeper transformation, a change in life meaning and purpose, which allows me to title this box as changes in spirituality. And we know that all of these elements interact with each other. I mean, the whole idea of physical body improving and functioning. If you have low back pain, it's hard to imagine that you experience a unitive state of consciousness. So what we're talking about in yoga is optimizing human functioning, optimizing our stress and emotion regulation so the mind does not interfere with the induction of these states, and increasing our self-regulation of our thought processes, so that those thought processes do not impede our experience of spirituality. So overall, we're making changes in global human functionality from the gross level of physical and mental health and performance to improvements in these skills of stress and emotion regulation, awareness, mindfulness, and metacognition, which then allows for the experiences of these positive behaviors, well-being, values, and a change in life purpose and meaning and spirituality. And in fact, we can also see a temporal change that occurs as people practice yoga and continue their yoga practice. So on the short term, and we are talking about certainly minutes or certainly a yoga class of practice, we see an immediate reduction in psychophysiological arousal. A down regulation of the sympathetic nervous system, down regulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the sense of quieting down the limbic system, which leads to a sense of physical and mental well-being. And Herbert Benson, the late meditation researcher, quantified this and characterized this as the relaxation response. It is the opposite of the fight or flight response or the stress response. Now, as individuals practice yoga regularly, now we're talking about weeks or months of regular practice, we see these sort of characteristics change. We see improvements in mind-body awareness or mindfulness, improvements in resilience and tolerance to stress, and overall self-regulation of internal state. And this is a semi-permanent change that really allows individuals to function more optimally in their day-to-day lives. And typically it takes a longer time, and we're talking here about months and years of regular yoga practice, typically, that we see a psychological and a philosophical transformation that many people who practice yoga report. And it's very interesting to hear the language that yoga practitioners use when they talk about this change that they've experienced in their lives with long-term regular yoga practice. And the phrase that I have heard so very often is this: yoga changed my life. And it sounds like a pretty innocent statement to make, but if one is talking about a change in life, this is a very profound transformation that these people are referring to. They're talking about a change in their perception of who they are, what their relationship is to themselves and the rest of the world. And it is often associated with this transformation, this change in values, a change in life goals. Typically, it's associated with a change from materialistic goals in life to non-materialistic goals in life. So people whose goals were entirely materialistic might quit their jobs. They might change their relationships to really focus on more non-materialistic and spiritually oriented goals in life. So this cartoon reads, "Nothing happens next. This is it." And meditation often seems like it is a state of nothingness, but it is not a state of nothingness. It is a state of regulating the attention networks to become more attuned and more capable of leading us into subtle states of consciousness. So what is some of the research in yoga and meditation on contemplative states? And this has been reviewed very eloquently by Elaine Wabe. And this is a systematic review, not just of yoga, but meditative and contemplative traditions as a whole. And what she found in this systematic review, that transcendent states were most consistently associated with slowed breathing, respiratory suspension, reduced muscle activity and EEG alpha blocking with external stimuli, and increased EEG alpha power, EEG coherence, and functional neural connectivity. The transcendent state is described as being in a state of relaxed wakefulness in a phenomenologically different space-time. So there's multiple things in this quote which really reemphasize many of things that I've said so far. In fact, the physical aspects of yoga are there. In yoga, we do slowed breathing. We do respiratory modulation. We do relaxation of muscles. We do try and change brain activity with the meditation practice. So you see that all as reflected here. And then this whole idea of relaxed wakefulness in a different space-time, this is referring to these symptoms that occur when one experiences this unitive state. And this is a paper published by a large number of meditation researchers, really talking about future directions in meditation research. And one of the areas that they feel is important is this idea of spirituality and the mystical state. And from that paper, they wrote, far less research is conducted on more challenging domains to measure, such as transpersonal and mystical and post-conventional stages of development associated with meditation. However, these components of meditation may be crucial to people's psychological and spiritual development, could represent important mediators and or mechanisms by which meditation confers benefits, and could themselves be important outcomes of meditation practices. And in that paper as well, they did a survey study in which they looked at the experiences that people have with this questionnaire, which is the Mystical Experience Questionnaire items. And they looked at all of the items in this questionnaire. And what they did was they rated whether the participants in the survey study almost always experienced these states, many times, a few times, once, or never. And what you can see is that in terms of the more obvious changes like feelings of peace and tranquility, you can see that over 40%, almost 50%, almost always experience those positive changes. And then as we get down to the more subtle changes, we can see the experience of ecstasy. Very few people experience that. And you see much more in terms of less experience with that. And so as one practices over time, you can see that fewer and fewer people actually achieve these deeper types of experiences because these experiences take a dedicated and disciplined long-term practice to really manifest. And so some people who are simply practicing yoga meditation casually, just for mundane purposes, such as to improve headaches or to improve muscle tension, may not experience these subtle states. But individuals who practice regularly as part of a yogic lifestyle may start to experience some more of these deeper types of mystically related experiences. So this cartoon reads, okay, if you've finished reaching enlightenment, you may go to the mall with your friends. So now I want to turn our attention to research on contemplative states with yoga. This is an area of research as well. This is a research paper published just a few years ago, and they reviewed the literature. According to the quantitative and qualitative studies reviewed, yoga practice seems to be positively associated with spirituality. This association concerns various aspects of spirituality, such as spiritual aspirations, a search for insight wisdom, an integrative worldview, a sense of meaning and peace, faith, hope, compassion, and happiness within. To harness the potential spiritual benefits of yoga, regular practice appears to be essential. Yoga practitioners seem to have both physical and spiritual motives for practicing. So a couple of important things here. Again, we're seeing these symptoms of the mystical state appearing in this sort of long-term spirituality. And it's also emphasizing this idea of regular practice in order to achieve some of these spiritual experiences. And the research that's been done is fairly minimal. There are some clinical case studies which have studied sort of spontaneous or triggered experiences. These are sort of the Kundalini awakenings. There are retrospective survey studies in yoga practitioners in which they measure spirituality in long-term practitioners. There have been very few real-time capture studies with EEG or neuroimaging. Some of these have been done with meditation, but not with yoga. And then there are now a few prospective studies with yoga practices. And I'll go through just a couple of these. And I'll start with retrospective research on yoga practitioners. And these are studies that have evaluated spirituality characteristics in people who are practicing yoga more intensively over a longer term. This is an older study that compared residents of a yoga ashram with non-residents of a yoga ashram. And residents of a yoga ashram are routinely daily practicing yoga and practicing a yoga lifestyle. And in terms of their responses to what degree they felt these subjective effects, becoming aware of a new reality, feeling a personality change, change in life, experience of oneness, or feeling in touch with the divine or spiritual, you can see that all of these characteristics are much higher in those that are practicing this ashram yoga lifestyle. So this suggests that more intensive practice is necessary to really get more of these types of spiritually related experiences. This is a survey study that looked at a number of different characteristics across yoga practitioners, and it actually measured perceived change. The individuals were reporting to what degree they had improved in these different aspects of human life. And what you can see is that spiritual health at the end here is much better and better and little better. Those are all showing improvements. And very few people have stayed the same or have gotten worse with respect to spiritual health. And this actually is one of many studies that have been done on long-term practitioners. We actually also did a survey study on long-term practitioners in which we asked them about transcendence. And we correlated their experience of transcendence with the number of hours per week, the total lifetime hours, and total calendar years of yoga practice, and found positive correlations. Again, supporting this idea that the more that people had practiced, the more they had experienced transcendence. Another study also looking at this in yoga practitioners have shown that those people who are yoga practitioners have higher scores of self-transcendence than individuals who have not been practicing yoga practice. And the same is true for transpersonal identification and self-differentiation. The yoga practitioners, the Ashtanga yoga practitioners, have experienced more of these unitive states than the controls who are not yoga practitioners. A survey study that was done in Germany used a religious spiritual well-being questionnaire and applied this to long-term yoga practitioners. And they divided analytically those that were practicing at a high level, moderately, or marginally. And what they found was a dose-response effect. Again, those that were practicing at a high level had the highest scores of spirituality. Those that were practicing yoga at a marginal level virtually had no difference from those that were not practicing. There are also improvements in these positive psychological states, which are also associated with spirituality. Hope, connectedness, and experiences of sense and meaning were also highest in those that were practicing at a high level. Now, spirituality has been documented as a reason for why yoga practitioners began yoga practice. This was a survey study we did in Austin, Texas, where we asked those that were participating in a beginner's yoga program why they were coming to yoga. And the major reasons were wellness, exercise, and stress. But here you can see in our sample, in that particular population, seeking a spiritual experience was definitely also a reason. This has been used in other studies as well. So this is a study done in Australia. And what they found here was that in terms of the spiritual path being a reason for beginning yoga practice, that was 19% of the population. But interestingly, they then asked, what are your continuing reasons, your current reasons for continuing yoga practice? What you see is an increase, a jump from 19%, virtually doubling, to 42.7%, suggesting that the spirituality has been something that they've experienced and has become more valuable to them, and now is a major reason for them to continue yoga practice. We also see this in another study here in which they looked at long-term practitioners and looked at spiritual well-being. Those people that practiced yoga for spiritual purposes had higher scores of well-being than those that were coming to yoga for strictly physical practice, physical reasons. Practitioners had greater initial and continued physical intentions than spiritual intentions. However, spiritual intentions became more salient over time, suggesting that Western yoga can cultivate spirituality. Results also showed that practitioners with spiritual intentions reported significantly higher psychological well-being. This idea of higher levels of practice is also reflected in this study by Crystal Park in Connecticut. And what she found was that students, in terms of the primary reason to adopt practice, for students it was low. And in current yoga teachers, it was also low. So only 5 and 7% had spirituality as a reason for beginning practice. But when you look at current reasons for practice, that has increased from 5% to 16%. And in yoga teachers, from 7% to 44%. Again, showing the same increase in the current reason of spirituality as a reason to continue yoga practice. Over 62% of students and 85% of teachers reporting having changed their primary reason for practicing or discovering other reasons. For both, the top changed primary reason was spirituality. Findings suggest that most initiate yoga practice for exercise and stress relief, but for many, spirituality becomes their primary reason for maintaining practice. So this is really indirect evidence of the role of yoga in increasing spirituality. This is a follow-up study by Crystal Park, Holger Kramer, in Germany. And again, you see the primary reason increasing from 11% to 26% of the population. And as a secondary reason, it has also increased. This was a study by Tina Cartwright at University of Westminster in London, looking at a UK population of long-term practitioners. Again, the initial reason of spirituality is around here at 2.5%. And as a current reason for continuing yoga practice, that has increased sevenfold, up to 22%. So again, really supporting indirectly this idea that yoga practice over the long term increases spirituality. So this cartoon reads, "On the family trip to nirvana." Are we there yet? Now, there's very little prospective yoga research on contemplative states. And this is an area that's very important because when we look at retrospective research, these are self-selected populations. And we want to see whether this can happen in prospective studies. One study that was done actually in occurring in meditation, this was done at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in India. They had an advanced meditator who was able to achieve this deeper mystical state. And what you can see in the EEG is a dramatic change in brain activity during this state of consciousness. And interestingly, you also see the slowing of heart rate, again, slowing the autonomic nervous system, quieting down the limbic system. Another place that we've seen prospective changes in people who have not self-selected have been in studies of yoga in cancer patients. So the spiritual well-being scale of the functional assessment of chronic illness therapy shows typically increases in scores of spirituality in cancer patients who have been given a yoga intervention compared to those that do not. We've also seen this in yoga studies in this particular outcome measure of life purpose and satisfaction. This was a study we did in clerical workers in Wales in the UK. And on their scores of life purpose and satisfaction, which touches on this deeper construct, we see increases over the course of an 8-week yoga intervention compared to controls. We've also looked at a 6-month intensive yoga practice. This was done, a study that was done in Germany. And what you can see is that there over the course of time, there are graduated increases in religious orientation, lightheartedness and relief, and scores of mindfulness. And this is interesting because this increase in mindfulness is this indication that we are changing our activity in the attention networks, becoming more mind-body aware, more mindful, and this is correlated with these improvements in these spiritually related constructs. Another prospective study has been done at the Deepak Chopra Center. What they did was they compared individuals who came to the center and just basically enjoyed the environment, ate the food, but did not do the practices. Another group did the meditative and yoga practices, and you can see the differences in scores and spirituality. And these changes occurred within just 1 month, which tells us that we can do these studies over the short term. In a follow-up study, they also showed that this non-dual state was also increased in those that practiced, as opposed to those who were in the control condition that did not practice yoga and meditation. The flow state I have mentioned earlier, and the flow is this sort of unitive state. It's an optimal psychological state, those moments when everything comes together for the performer. It's often associated with high levels of performance and a positive experience. And it is very similar to the mystical state in that it has a lot of these clear characteristics. There's a loss of self-consciousness, a time transformation, and an autotelic experience, this sort of deeper unitive state. And it has often been experienced by musicians. Sometimes musicians talk about this archaic merger being taken over during a performance, a type of ecstasy, an experience of being so much at one with the music that it seems to be playing itself. There is certain being taken out of oneself, and this has something with the common oceanic experience. And so this is during performance, and it is basically this similar mystical state of consciousness. And there actually has been a questionnaire developed to study the flow state. And what we did was we applied this in a study that we were doing with the young adult musicians. After 6 weeks of yoga, we saw increases in the flow state from the dispositional flow scale compared to control subjects that did not do the yoga. And on other questionnaires, we saw trends for improvement in this construct of time shift, this construct of this autotelic state, and this sense of merging in the yoga group as compared to the controls. So, and these changes were occurring in just 6 weeks of yoga practice. So again, it is possible to measure these spiritual states of consciousness over the short term. Interestingly, another study done by researchers in transcendental meditation and they are starting to do yoga practices at their facility. And what they found was that compared to individuals that were practicing the yoga, all of these individuals were practicing transcendental meditation. But in those individuals that were also practicing yoga, their scores on transpersonal qualities were higher than those, and transpersonal self were higher than those that were just practicing the yoga. The group that was just practicing meditation had no changes in these constructs over time. But when people started practicing yoga, these scores increased, suggesting that there is something about the physical practices, the pranayama, the deep relaxation, and the asanas that may facilitate these deeper experiences. Furthermore, we've also seen in some of our qualitative interviews, in some of our yoga studies, we have seen quotes that really are consistent with this change in life perspective. So in a study that we've done on occupational workers, a 6-week yoga intervention, these are the quotes from some participants. "This has been a life-changing, grounding experience." Another said, "I've noticed a positive shift in my entire life." Another one said, "I've experienced a renewed sense of purpose, increased appreciation for life, stillness, mindfulness, and nature, life-changing." And then finally, from this participant, "With yoga, I had a connection of mind, body, and spirit. During the practice, when you become aware of those three things or be aware of them, it seems like things are more possible. I had more peace, the idea of increased peace of mind. I mean, what could be richer than a sense of, a spirit, my spiritual self?" And this was actually in a population of subjects that had post-traumatic stress disorder. So this change in spirituality can be very important for patient populations. So I am supported and work with the Kundalini Research Institute, which supports the style of yoga that I practice, which is Kundalini Yoga. I also work with the International Association of Yoga Therapists, which accredits yoga therapy schools, certifies yoga therapists. It runs the Symposium on Yoga Research, which I coordinate, and the International Journal of Yoga Therapy, on which I serve as the editor-in-chief. And I kind of close with this cartoon here. I would have attained enlightenment long ago if I had only listened to my mother. And I will leave you with something sort of spiritually oriented with respect to yoga. This is an ancient drawing showing the subtle energy mechanisms that are believed to take place in yoga, the chakras, leading to the ultimate state of consciousness in the crown chakra, where it's believed this samadhi experience, this unitive state of consciousness, is experienced.